Hello, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're listening. Thank you so much for checking into Radio Retrospekt, where we give you the history of the world 1 year at a time. And the only way, we can really do this is to break it down in sections, break it down into sections. So we'll be covering international events, American events, science and innovation, culture. My name is Antonio Polanco. I'll be your host. I have gotten a little bit of feedback from you guys about the podcast. So I myself, I'm not a history buff. I'm not a history major or a historian in any way, shape, or form. But I'm learning, and I really love the stories that history has to tell us. And reading history, we understand the world in these, snapshots of time. And history tells us where we came from. It gives us an understanding of our society as a whole, or by country. It gives us a sense of our achievements, our injustices. And, what I found is it helps us determine if we've progressed, if we've gotten worse, or if we've gotten better in history. So what we do is we devote every episode on a single year, and we're going to keep true to that. But with some of these events, we may go backward or forward in time. Just to give you guys a little bit of context or updated information. So with all that said, I want to thank you again for listening, and we don't have a lot of time, actually, so we have a lot to cover. Let's listen to this. That what you heard was Long Player. Long Player started in the year 2000, so we are covering the year 2000, just so you guys aren't confused. It's a piece of music that's designed to last for 1,000 years. So it started to play at the stroke of midnight, December 31st, 1999, January 1st, 2000. And if all goes as planned, it's going to continue without repetition until December 31st, 2999, and then it'll actually restart on that date. It was conceived and composed by Jem Feiner and was originally produced as an Art Angel commission, but is now in the care of the Long Player Trust. Long Player can be heard in the Lighthouse at Trinity Buoy Wharf in London, where it has been playing since it started in the year 2000. It's based on an existing piece of music, 20 minutes and 20 seconds in length. It's processed by a computer using just a single algorithm, and this gives us a large number of variations, which, when played consecutively, gives the total expected runtime of 1,000 years. All right, so the year 2000, Y2K. It's sometimes abbreviated or infamously known as Y2K. The Y stands for year, and the K stands for kilo, which means 1,000, so 2000. It was designated as the World Mathematical Year by the Declaration of Rio, and the year 2000 was also designated as the International Year for the Culture of Peace. Which was centered really on civil society, having a civil society as much as possible. And the lead organization for the International Year for the Culture of Peace was UNESCO, or the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. It's a specialized agency of the United Nations, and its purpose is to contribute to peace and security by promoting international collaboration through educational, scientific, and cultural reforms in order to increase universal respect for justice, the rule of law, and human rights, along with freedom, fundamental freedom proclaimed in the UN Charter. So UNESCO, they do their objectives through 5 major programs: education, natural sciences, social and human sciences, culture, and communication or information. And another initiative that they had was the Culture of Peace News Network, otherwise known as CPNN, and that is a UN-authorized interactive online network committed to supporting the global movement for a culture of peace and nonviolence. All right, so all that said, let's take a look at the at the economics in the year 2000. So we have average income is about $40,000 a year. Average monthly rent was $675. A gallon of gas that cost $1.26. If you wanted to buy a new car in the year 2000, that would have run you about $24,750. And then other stuff. The stamp, U.S. stamp, cost 33 cents. A pound of bacon was about $3. A pound of coffee, ground coffee, was $3.44. A dozen eggs was 89 cents. And the U.S. population in the year 2000 was 281,421,906 people. And actually, the U.S. Lifespan was upgraded to 77 years. All right, let's go into international stories for a bit. So we're going to start with a man you guys might know. His name was Karol J. Wojtyla, or as he's better known, Pope John Paul II. He was the longest reigning pope in modern history. He was the first non-Italian pope in 455 years, and he was the first pope from a non-Slavic country, which was Poland. He took his message on the road. He visited something like 130 countries on 104 trips, and he was the 263rd successor to the Apostle Peter. But in the year 2000, he did a few things. He apologized for the wrongdoings by, this is actually probably his most well-known things that he did this year. He apologized for the wrongdoings by members of the Roman Catholic Church throughout the ages. So he visited Yad Vashem, which is the National Holocaust Memorial in Israel, and prayed at one of the holiest sites in Judaism, which was the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And he placed a letter inside that wall in which he prayed for forgiveness for the actions against Jews. And part of his address at the time, he said, "I assure the Jewish people, the Catholic Church is deeply saddened by this hatred, acts of persecution and displays of anti-Semitism directed against the Jews by Christians at any time and in any place." So he added that, there were no words strong enough to deplore the, terrible tragedy of the Holocaust. He did a few other things too. So Pope John Paul II, along with Karakin II, or the Karakin II, by then the Catholicos of all Armenians issued a joint statement condemning also the Armenian suicide. And Pope John Paul II was the first modern pope to visit Egypt, where he met with the Coptic Pope, Pope Shenouda III, and the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Alexandria. And the Coptic Church, just so you guys know, is the largest Christian church in Egypt and Northeast Africa. It was established, or according to tradition, it was established by Saint Mark, who was an apostle and an evangelist in the middle of the 1st century. Pope John Paul II also publicly endorsed the Jubilee 2000 campaign on African debt relief, and actually got with Irish rock stars Bob Geldof and Bono, and actually interrupted a U2 recording session by telephoning the studio and asking to speak to Bono personally. All right, let's take a look at what else is going on in this crazy world of ours in the year 2000. So we had President Kim Dae-jung of South Korea meeting with Kim Jong Il, not King Jong Il, no, Kim Jong Kim Jong Il, who was the leader of North Korea for the beginning of the first ever Inter-Korea Summit in Pyongyang, North Korea. So the two leaders, they talked about a range of issues. They wanted to, reopen roads and railways across the super heavily armored border between North and South Korea. They talked about reuniting tens of thousands of Korean families who were separated during the Korean War, and created a telephone hotline for discussions during these crises. So in August of 2000, after over 50 years of separation, members of separated families and relatives in North and South Korea had a reunification meeting with each other in Pyongyang and in Seoul. And then subsequent inter-Korean summit talks were held. The North-South Joint Declaration was later adopted, and Kim Dae-jung, actually, who was the South Korean president at the time, he received the Nobel Peace Prize for successfully arranging the summit. But it was later discovered that the South Korean government actually paid North Korea approximately $200 million American dollars to attend the summit. The payment was kept secret, and news of the payoff only emerged in 2003. So this became a major political scandal, which was later called the Cash for Summit scandal. All right, and in September of 2000, and this international story actually takes place in New York, but I wanted to include it. It was the leaders from around the world attended the Millennium Summit at UN headquarters, which was at the time the largest gathering of world leaders in history. The purpose of the summit was to discuss roles in the UN at the turn of the 21st century. And, later on in this meeting, world leaders ratified the UN Millennium Declaration. And the Millennium Declaration was an internationally agreed upon framework that had 8 chapters and key objectives. It was adopted by 189 world leaders, and it stressed the observance of international human rights law and international humanitarian law under the principles of the UN Charter. The Millennium Declaration goals are interdependent. They influence health, and health influences, all the Millennium Declaration goals. So, in other words, better health enables children to learn and adults to earn. Gender equality is essential for the achievement of better health, and reducing hunger, poverty, environmental degradation, that positively influences, but it also depends on better health. So let's take a look at the chapters and the goals of the Millennium Declaration. So you had 8 chapters. The delegates at this summit, they agreed on the following 8 chapters. Number 1, value and principles, which included freedom, equality, solidarity. I swear, I read this and it's literally like Bernie Sanders wrote it, for all you Bernie fans out there. Freedom, equality, solidarity, tolerance, shared responsibility, and respect for nature. Number 2, peace, security, and disarmament. Number 3, development and poverty eradication. Number 4, protecting our common environment. Number 5, human rights, democracy, and good governance. Number 6, protecting the vulnerable. Number 7, meeting the special needs of Africa. And lastly, number 8, strengthening the United Nations. And then the 8 Millennium Development Goals were, number 1, to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. Number 2, to achieve universal primary education. 3, to promote gender equality and empower women. 4, to reduce child mortality. 5, to improve maternal health. 6, to combat AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. 7, to ensure environmental sustainability. And lastly, number 8, which was to develop a global partnership for development. Today, the Millennium Development Goals have actually since transitioned into 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are to be completed by the year 2030. Okay. All right, cool. And actually, 2000 was a big year in sports. It was the year of the Summer Olympics, which were held in Sydney, Australia. Sydney 2000, or, some people call them the Millennium Olympic Games. Sydney was selected to host the games in 1993, but it beat out Beijing, Berlin, Istanbul, and Manchester. So to give you guys an idea of how important it was to Sydney to get the Olympic Games, a lot of Australians consider sport a way of life. And, after everything was said and done, many people thought that, what Sydney had put on was a fantastic spectacle of sport, in a good way. Spectacles, are usually bad, but this was the good kind of spectacle. We had a record 10,651 athletes, 4,069 of them being women, from 199 nations participating in the Sydney Olympics. The only nation that was excluded was Afghanistan. Triathlon and Taekwondo were 2 new additions to the Olympic program. We had the first Sri Lankan women, and again, I apologize. It's always trouble with Sri Lankan names for me, but this was Susanthika Jayasinth. She was the first Sri Lankan woman to win a medal, claiming the bronze in 200 meter, while Birgit Fisher earned 2 gold medals in kayaking, and she became the first woman in any sport to win medals 20 years apart. Women also took part in weightlifting and the first modern pentathlon for the first time. And I actually, it's funny, I had never heard about the pentathlon before this research, but the pentathlon is an Olympic sport that contains 5, very different events. You have fencing, 200-meter freestyle swimming, show jumping, and a final combined event of pistol shooting and a 3,200-meter cross-country run. In addition to that, we had the rapprochement of the 2 Koreas. So Korea, going back to, Korean unity, South Korea and North Korea marched together under the same flag. And Russian gymnast Alexei Nemov took home 6 medals, as he had done in Atlanta in 1996. And then Australia's own 17-year-old hometown hero, Ian Thorpe. He gave, his fellow countrymen plenty to cheer for, and he went by the nickname Thorpedo. He won 3 golds in the pool. If you remember, Sydney 2000, you might also remember, the American sprint queen Marion Jones. She won 3 gold medals and 2 bronze medals for the U.S. at Sydney, but then she later had to relinquish them in October 2007 after confessing that she had taken THG, during the games. So she eventually was banned. She was banned from competing for 2 years by the IAAF after the Olympics. That was the International Association of Athletics Federation, banned her for 2 years. And, in total, there was 28 sports, 300 events, and 928 medals given out. The U.S. won the most medals at 93, while, hometown Australia, who was hosting the event, they came in 4th with 58. The cost of Sydney 2000 cost about $6.6 billion. And later that year, in October, the Paralympic Games actually took place, and that was a major international event involving athletes with a range of physical disabilities, including, everything from impaired muscle power to impaired range of movement, limb deficiency, leg length difference, and vision impairment and intellectual impairment. So that, the Paralympic Games happened later on in that year. So what else is going on? I'm just rattling these off to you guys. I'm sorry. We only have so much time to cover the history of the world in a year. 2000 was also the year that mad cow disease caused a big alarm in Europe because of its growth. Mad cow disease, or, as it's known in the scientific community, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, is a transmutable, slowly progressive, degenerative, and fatal disease affecting the central nervous system of full-grown adult cattle. One notable sign that you guys will see is, cows affected by mad cow disease, were progressively deteriorating showing progressively deteriorating behavioral and neurological signs. One notable sign, and one that you saw in a lot of the clips at the time, was the increase of aggression. They reacted excessively to noise or touch, or they became ataxic, which is an ability to coordinate voluntary muscular movements, which is what you saw, kind of like shaking cows and them falling to the ground. By the end, at present day, it had killed 177 people in the UK and 52 elsewhere. This is present day, just the stats after all was said and done. And between 460,000 and 482,000 mad cow disease infected animals had entered the human food chain before the controls were put on high risk variety meats, organ meats, were introduced in 1989. We also had in December of 2000, control of the Panama Canal, which is the canal joining the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, was handed back to Panama after 75 years of U.S. control. So before the Panama Canal opened, you guys, in 1914, ships would travel between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and they had to travel, a precarious, it is listed here, precarious 8,000 nautical miles around the tip of South America. The canal itself runs about 50 miles long. It had been run by the U.S. Defense Department since it opened in August of 1914. And before that, nearly 22,000 people died from malaria and work accidents that were related to building the canal. But the transfer of sovereignty to Panama was agreed in the Torrijos and Carter Treaty of 1977, and former U.S. President Jimmy Carter actually attended the ceremonial handover of the canal. The new operators of the waterway, which handled at the time in 2000 about 14,000 ships a year, was passed to the Panama Canal Authority a few years before the change over to the year 2000 to avoid any possible computer problems. People really were, and just remembering in 2000, people really were freaking out about Y2K. It might have been the end of the world, and computers everywhere were, gonna implode. But we'll get into all the Y2K scares and the history of Y2K a little later on. Alrighty. All right. So in the U.S., we're gonna move on to the United States. Things that were going on in the United States in the year 2000. We'll start with I guess we'll start in January. January 10th, America Online, or AOL, agreed to purchase Time Warner in a deal that was valued at about $350 billion. This was the biggest merger in U.S. history. It was the largest ever corporate merger, and unfortunately, later was considered to be one of the worst mergers of all time. At AOL, a lot of people thought that. So let's take a step back. Let's look at both companies real quick. At AOL, a lot of people thought that the merger was, a really good move. At the times, the .coms were, could do no wrong, and AOL was at the head of the pack. AOL's sky high stock market value, bid up by investors looking for that sweet windfall, made the young company AOL more valuable in market cap terms than many blue chips. And then at Time Warner, on the other side of things, Time Warner, they tried and they failed to establish an online presence before the merger. So here they thought, let's combine our companies. And the strategy at the time seemed fine. Time Warner via AOL, they would have a footprint in tens of millions of homes of new subscribers, and AOL would benefit from access to Time Warner's cable network, as well as to content. But merging of the cultures of AOL and Time Warner was problematic from the start. The lawyers and the executives, they did their conventional due diligence on the numbers, but they didn't do so well doing the due diligence on the cultures. The aggressive and many said arrogant AOL. This was actually a funny quote in a news article I read on this story. The aggressive and many said arrogant AOL people were horrified by the more corporate Time Warner side. And all these, joint ventures and cooperation and promised synergies, they didn't really materialize, and they didn't really have respect, that mutual, more of a mutual disrespect came to color their relationships. And then the bubble burst, the .com bubble burst. A few months after the deal closed, the economy went into recession. There was no money for advertising. AOL was actually forced to take a goodwill write-off of $99 billion in 2002. And they were losing subscribers, subscription revenue. The total value of AOL stock went from $226 billion to about $20 billion. And then, years after, we saw job losses. We saw retirement accounts being, decimated. We saw investigations by the Security and Exchange Commission and the Justice Department. So today, the combined values of AOL and Time Warner, which have since separated, is about 1/7 of their worth on the day of the merger. Also in the U.S., we had the Washington A16 protest were held in Washington, D.C. It was an anti-globalization protest. It was a series of protests in Washington, D.C. against the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. So the annual IMF and World Bank meetings were the scene for these protests, and which had actually begun in 1999, the year before. In 2000, at Washington A16, between 10,000 and 15,000 protesters demonstrated at the IMF and the World Bank meeting. Mass arrests, were conducted. Hundreds of people were arrested. There was a reported 678 people arrested in one day. And then if we look at so let's take a look at the motivation of the protesters, right? They based their criticisms on a couple of different ideas, but what was shared was that participants opposed what they saw as, these humongous multinational corporations having unregulated political power that they exercise through trade agreements, through deregulated financial markets. Specifically, corporations were accused or are accused of seeking to maximize profit at the expense of where I feel like the ghost of Bernie Sanders has just taken over me right now. No, Bernie Sanders still very much alive. God bless him. Love you, Bernie. So corporations, they were accused of seeking to maximize profit at our expense, at the expense of work safety conditions and standards, labor hiring, compensation standards, environmental conservation principles, and the integrity of the national legislative authority, independence, and sovereignty. So basically, the Washington A16 protesters, they're talking about economic inequality and this rigged game economy that has been shed more of a light on in the past couple of years. But they also wanted to talk about the changes in the global economy, like turbo capitalism, market fundamentalism, McWorld, casino capitalism. So they were really protesting all these things that, again, is all part of the rigged game economy that we're finding out more and more of these days. Here's a name you haven't heard in a while, Elian Gonzalez, right? So 2000 was the year that federal agents seized 6-year-old Elian Gonzalez from his relative's Miami home in a pre-dawn raid, and then they flew him to his Cuban father in Washington, D.C., and this ended one of the most publicized custody battles in U.S. history. There was a story about Elian Gonzalez in the news every single day. But let's go back. So little Elian Gonzalez was rescued from a boat accident that unfortunately killed his mother and, worse, killed a small group of other Cuban refugees trying to reach Florida in November of 1999. After 2 Florida fishermen found Elian stranded on an inner tube floating offshore near Fort Lauderdale on Thanksgiving Day, members of his extended family took him into their care. By then, Elian celebrated his 6th birthday in December of 99. He had become a symbol of this long-running feud between the community of Cuban exiles living in the U.S. and in Florida and the Cuban leader Fidel Castro. And even as Elian's Miami relatives, his great-uncles Lázaro and Delfin Gonzalez, and his mother Marilesis Gonzalez, insisted that he stay in the U.S. and gain the new life that, his mother obviously, or not obviously, but the life that his mother wanted him to have. Castro and, Elian's family in Cuba, and eventually, our government, the U.S. government, they stood behind the father. They stood behind his father, Juan Miguel Gonzalez, who very simply wanted his son back. So again, after months of, court battles, endless press coverage, and heated demonstrations in both Miami and Cuba, U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno, with the full backing of President Bill Clinton, ordered that Elian's relatives in Miami surrender him to the U.S. Department of Justice's custody. So Elian was flown on April 22nd. Elian was flown to Washington, D.C. He was immediately reunited with his dad, Juan Miguel, and they returned to Cuba. Of course, greeted with a hero's welcome, a lot of fanfare. And the Gonzalez family was, reported to enjoy special treatment from the Castro administration. And for a lot of years, believe it or not, Fidel Castro actually attended a lot of Elian's birthday parties. So where's Elian now? He is pursuing his career, or it's reported that he's pursuing his career in industrial engineering at the University of Matanzas. All right. So what else happened in the U.S.? So we went over the UN Millennium Declaration, which was made in New York City on September 8th. We kind of covered that. An international story, but it happened in the U.S. The year 2000 also saw the year of R2D2. Jesus, this is what happens when you're watching Star Wars all the time. RU486. So, are you familiar with RU486? RU486 is also known as Mifeprex, which is the abortion pill, and that won U.S. approval in September. It was developed Mifeprex was developed in 1980 and came into use in France in 1987. And it was eventually approved by the FDA in the year 2000. It only took us 13 years to approve. Hooray, progress. RU486, Mifeprex, of course, been the topic of heated debate among pro-lifers, pro-choicers, politicians, the religious community. It's a medication. It's typically used with misoprostol. I am so sorry if I mispronounced that. And it ends early pregnancy. So this combination of these two drugs is more than 95% effective during the first 50 days of pregnancy, but is also shown to be effective in the second trimester of pregnancy. The drug can only be can only be prescribed by a physician after a HCG test, which measures the specific level of HCG in the blood. HCG is a hormone. That's produced in the body during pregnancy. Doctors also need to perform a sonogram to confirm and date the pregnancy. And RU486 is approved for use, like I said, up to the 49th day of pregnancy, or about 7 weeks. And listen, you should not. The FDA does recommend that you not buy Mifeprex over the internet, because you're going to bypass a lot of important safeguards that is designed to protect a woman's health and the health of others. So, 2000, we also saw one of the worst environmental disasters in our country's history, considered worse than the Exxon Valdez, and that was the Martin County coal slurry spill, where 250 million gallons of coal sludge was spilled in Martin County, Kentucky. It was an accident. It occurred after midnight in October, when the bottom of a coal slurry impoundment, which was owned by Macy Energy in Martin County, Kentucky, broke into an abandoned underground mine below. So the slurry came out of the mine openings, and it sent, actually it wasn't even 250 million gallons. It was closer to 300 million gallons of slurry down the Tug Fork River. So by morning, Wolf Creek in Kentucky was oozing with this black waste. The spill was over 5 feet deep in places. It covered nearby residents' yards. It produced hundreds of miles of pollution in the Big Sandy River and the Ohio River. And the water supply for over 27,000 residents was contaminated. And of course, all aquatic life in that region was pretty much destroyed. The spill was 30 times larger than the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which was only at 12 million gallons U.S. And one of the worst environmental disasters ever in the southeastern United States, according to the EPA. It was only exceeded in volume by the Kingston fossil plant coal fly ash spill slurry spill in 2008. Another really awful event happened in October of this year. We had the USS Cole was badly damaged by two Al-Qaeda suicide bombers in Yemen. And what they did was they had placed we had two bombers place a bunch of explosives into this small boat, and then it eventually went up to the USS Cole and exploded it. So let's go back. The USS Cole is named in honor of Marine Sergeant Darrell S. Cole, who was a machine gunner killed in action on Iwo Jima in World War II. And at the time of the attack, the ship was carrying a crew of 293 people and was en route to the Persian Gulf to help enforce an oil embargo against Iraq. The Cole itself, at the time, was a nearly new state-of-the-art destroyer. Witnesses later said that this small boat comes up against the USS Cole, and crew members actually saw the two suicide bombers behind these two large garbage barges that had left the boat and was coming back. And so when they came back, it was these two barges, and instead of a third barge, it was this small boat. And a lot of the crew members didn't really think much of it. The suicide bombers actually came so close prior to the explosion that sailors on the USS Cole exchanged greetings with them. But the explosion itself was so powerful that people reported that buildings near the port shook. And the captain of the USS Cole, Kirk Leopold, he described the situation in which the attack occurred. He said that he had arranged for 3 garbage barges to come out. So these, think of these barges as like these huge flat steel boats with garbage on them. They were supposed to unload the trash and then come back. And he says by around 11 o'clock that morning, 2 boats had come out and the crew was unloading trash. I was turned back to my desk doing routine paperwork when at 11:18 in the morning there was a thunderous explosion. And it's just sad. It's sad. The attack represented the first major international terrorist attack on a U.S. facility since the 1998 bombings of the embassy in Kenya and Tanzania, and the deadliest against a U.S. naval vessel since the USS Stark came under Iraqi attack in 1987. I'm sorry, I had to stop because the whole Stark thing. I've been watching Game of Thrones. It's a whole situation. But back to the USS Cole. Let's go back. So according to, Congress, of course, wanted to see what had happened. They wanted their own report on the Cole attack before the destroyer arrived at Yemen it was only supposed to be a brief refueling stop. The Cole was actually required to file a force protection plan for the visit. And at the time of the attack, the Cole was operating under a heightened state of readiness against a potential terrorist attack. Threat condition Bravo, if you're into the lingo there. It included steps that were specifically intended to provide protection against attack by small boats. But Captain Leopold, unfortunately, he failed to take about a dozen of the required safety precautions on the day of the attack. And despite, their readiness, Leopold and his crew, they received no punishment. But 40 crew members were wounded and 17 were killed. We also had in New York that summer the Puerto Rican Day Parade attacks. Those occurred on June 11th. They involved multiple assailants that had harassed, sexually assaulted and robbed random victims. A lot of the attacks were caught on video, and the attacks itself received worldwide attention. The NYPD was really criticized for their handling of the attacks. Eventually, over 50 women reported being either harassed or assaulted. 11 police officers and 3 911 operators were disciplined, and the city ended up paying over $500,000 in lawsuit settlements to victims. And then Mayor Rudy Giuliani actually banned alcohol at the parade the following year. The year 2000 also saw this in July. The state of Vermont passed HB 847, which legalized civil unions for same-sex couples. The bill was a result of a December Vermont Supreme Court ruling in Baker versus Vermont, in which a same-sex couple sued for the right to a state-recognized marriage. And Vermont then became the second U.S. state after California to offer legal status to same-sex couples, and the first to offer a civil union status encompassing the same legal rights and responsibilities of marriages. All right, so let's hit up the kind of like the political scene in 2000, and I know you guys are thinking of the obvious story. We'll get to that. But first, 2000, November 7th, 2000, Hillary Rodham Clinton was elected to the U.S. Senate. She became the first lady of the United States to win public office. Initially, a lot of people thought that she was going to face Rudy Giuliani as her Republican opponent. But Giuliani withdrew in May of 2000. He had been diagnosed with prostate cancer. There were stories about his, marriage kind of failing. Those became public. So Clinton instead had to face Rick Lazio, who was a Republican member of the House of Representatives. The combined campaigns of Clinton and Lazio, along with Giuliani's initial effort, they spent a record combined $90 million, which I'm sure could have gone to a lot of better causes. Sorry, got a little real there. Clinton won the election by 55% of the vote to Lazio's 43, and she was the first and so far only woman to have held an elective office either while or after serving as First Lady. And, we see this as, a major milestone in Hillary Clinton's career. And as we saw in June of this year, on Tuesday, June 7th, she became the first female U.S. presidential candidate for a major political party. All right. Also at that time, we had our own election. We had another election, the presidential election, where Republican governor of Texas, George W. Bush, defeated Democratic Vice President Al Gore in the U.S. presidential election. But, that miscount, that Floridian miscount, those Floridian miscounts, resulted in a recount of the votes. And, a lot of people consider the 2000 presidential election as the endless election. And we'll go into that a little bit later. But what did we see? We saw Ralph Nader, who was the Green Party candidate. He gained widespread public attention during this election when the ticket composed of Ralph Nader and Winona LaDuke won 2.7% of the popular votes. Unfortunately, they didn't win any electoral votes. Nader was actually, vilified by the Democrats, who accused him of spoiling the election for Al Gore. And his impact on the election, to this day remains very controversial. This was the one of only 4 elections and the first in 100 years, 1824, 1876, 1888, 2000, lastly 2000, where the popular vote winner was defeated. So on election night, we didn't have a clear winner. Print media, broadcast media, they cited contradictory exit polling numbers. The races in Oregon and New Mexico were too close to call for a few days. But ultimately, the contest focused on Florida. So initially, Gore was projected the winner in Florida. That's what the news networks reported. But then they later declared that Bush had opened a huge lead. So Gore that night called Bush to concede the election, but it became kind of clear that the Florida race was much more closer than Gore's staff thought. Fewer than 600 votes apparently separated the candidates, and it seemed to be narrowing. That margin seemed to be narrowing. So at 3 a.m. that November 7th, Gore called a stunned Bush to retract his concession. Let's take a look at what happened here exactly. So Florida election law. They required a mandatory statewide a mandatory statewide machine recount. The recount was complete, and Bush's lead stood at 327 votes out of 6 million cast. Okay. We had county officials. They tried to check voter intent through what was called a cloud of hanging chads, which were incompletely punched paper ballots. And also pregnant chads, which were paper ballots that were dimpled but not pierced during the voting process, as well as overvotes, which were ballots that recorded multiple votes for the same office, and undervotes, which were ballots that recorded no vote for a given office. And we also had the reported butterfly ballot design used in Palm Beach County, which caused a lot of confusion among Gore voters, prompting them to inadvertently, cast their vote for third-party candidate Pat Buchanan, who actually received some 3,400 votes. But again, the Bush campaign, they wanted to file an appeal after the Florida Supreme Court decided that they wanted to do a statewide manual recount of about 45,000 of these undervotes. The Bush campaign asked the Supreme Court to delay the recounts until it could hear the case. And a stay was issued by the Supreme Court on December 9th. 3 days later, on December 12th, concluding that a fair statewide recount could not be performed in the time to meet the December 18th deadline for the state's electors, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a 5-4 decision to stop the Florida presidential recount, and ultimately awarded the presidency to George W. Bush. And by winning Florida, Bush narrowly won the electoral vote over Gore by 271 to 266, that magic number being 270. Gore did win the popular vote over Bush by about 500,000 votes. But again, after 36 days and all the back and forth, the Florida recount battle, Al Gore finally conceded the presidency to George W. Bush on December 13th, 2000. A few other sort of noteworthy stories. We had the U.S. Supreme Court. They ruled that the FDA lacked the authority to regulate tobacco as an addictive drug, throwing out the Clinton administration's main anti-smoking initiative. And we also had in the Supreme Court the U.S. versus Microsoft Corp. case, where Microsoft was ruled to have violated United States antitrust laws by keeping down their competitors using Internet Explorer. So it's a U.S. antitrust case, and Microsoft was basically accused of becoming a monopoly and engaging in abusive practices contrary to the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act. And finally, we had the founder of Microsoft, or finally in U.S., we still got a lot to cover, people. A lot to cover. Founder of Microsoft, Bill Gates, left his position as CEO. He's, of course, Bill Gates, one of the richest men in the world, one of the best-known entrepreneurs of the PC revolution. He remained as chairman and created the position of chief software architect for himself. But as we saw, Gates eventually became a philanthropist. He donated money to a lot of different charitable organizations and projects and scientific research programs through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which was also established in 2000. All right, so that's U.S., people. We're going to go on to a little bit of science and innovation and a little bit of just a scotch, just a little bit of economics. But let's talk about science and innovation in the year 2000. The story of the year, of course, the concerns about the Millennium Bug, the Y2K bug. They passed without any of the widespread computer failures and malfunctions that people thought was going to happen. Y2K is a numerum. It's a numerum is a number-based word, like 9/11 or 24/7. The first printed mention of Y2K was made by Paul Gillen in Computer World in 1984, and the first printed warning of Y2K was issued by Peter de Jager in the pages of Computer World in 1993. So when these computer programs were being written in 1960 and from 1960s to the 80s, computer engineers, they just, used a 2-digit code for the year. The 19 was left out of 1970. So instead of, a date reading 1970, it just read 70. Engineers, they shortened the date because data storage in computers cost a lot of money at the time and took up a lot of space. But as the year 2000 came, programmers realized that PCs might not read 00 as 2000. They might read it as 1900. They feared that, it might be damaged or flawed, and the programming might get damaged or flawed, that computers might interpret December or the day after December 31st, 1999, it might go to January 1st, 1900. The assumption that this 20th century date was, always understood caused a lot of various errors. They feared that it might, of course, incorrectly display dates. It might incorrectly mark records, dated records, or real-time events. Y2K was both a software and hardware problem, and software and hardware companies raced quickly to fix the bug and provided Y2K compliant programs to help. But it turns out that, they just simply decided to change the date from 2 digits to a 4-digit number. But people were freaking out at that time. They thought that everything from banking institutions to the stock market to the transportation industry, all these different companies and centers of technology might be affected. But when January 1st, 2000 came, a lot of the problems that happened were really minor, or they were generally regarded as minor. A lot of people dismissed the Y2K bug as like a hoax or end of the world cult. There were a few problems. Very few problems. So we had in France, the National Weather Forecasting Service, Météo France, said a Y2K bug made the date on a web page show a map with Saturday's weather forecast as 01/01/19/19100. This also occurred on other websites, including att.net. In Sheffield, in the UK, incorrect Down syndrome test results were sent to 154 pregnant women, and 2 abortions were carried out as a direct result of the Y2K bug. 4 babies with Down syndrome were also born to mothers who had been told they were in the low-risk group. And then a few things happened actually also in Asia. In Ishikawa, Japan, radiation monitoring equipment failed at midnight. However, officials said the public wasn't at risk. In Onagawa, Japan, an alarm sounded at a nuclear power plant at 2 minutes after midnight. NTT Mobile Communications Network, which is Japan's largest cellular operator, reported on January 1st, 2000 that some models of mobile telephones were deleting new messages received. Did that give you guys chills? Your texts just randomly being deleted? Rather than, the older messages being deleted as the memory filled up. In Australia, bus ticket validation machines in 2 states failed to operate. In the U.S., 150 slot machines at racetracks. Sorry, all you OTB fans. A little bit of a problem there with Y2K. 150 slot machines at racetracks in Delaware stopped working. And the U.S. Naval Observation, which runs the master clock that keeps the country's official time, gave the date on its website as January 1st, 19,100. Countries like Italy, Russia, South Korea, they actually did little to prepare for Y2K. And they ended up spending, they had no more gigantic tech problems than other countries like the U.S. They spent millions of dollars, the U.S. spent millions of dollars to combat the problem. All told, it was calculated that the U.S. spent about $134 billion preparing for Y2K and another $13 billion fixing problems in 2000 and 2001. Worldwide, about $308 billion was estimated to have been spent on Y2K remediation. The other major story, of course, the dot-com bubble bursting and thousands of dot-coms going bust. So in March of 2000, the NASDAQ Composite Stock Market Index peaked at 5,132.52, signaling the beginning of the end of the dot-com boom. In reading about this story, we know the internet, we know it's changed the world, it's become a major part of our lives. It's pretty much involved in how we shop, how we communicate, how we receive and disseminate information, how we do business, how we live. And what's been called this, at the time, was this overly optimistic expectations of the potential of the internet created this now infamous dot-com bubble of the later half of the 90s. The dot-com bubble grew out of a combination of the presence of speculative investing, the abundance of venture capital funding for startups, but ultimately the failure for these dot-coms to turn a profit. They poured money into all these different dot-com startups in the 90s, hoping that one day they would be profitable. They were driven by a lot of these internet companies were these dot-coms. They were launched, and investors just thought, hey, a company operating online, it does really well, probably worth millions. Of course, online retailing was one of the biggest drivers of this growth. I don't know if you guys remember all those pets.com commercials with that cute little sock puppet mascot and the funny ads. That got a lot of attention. That got a lot of big investors, and it became a place in American consumer culture. And then with this excitement and this increasing investment, stock values grew. The value of the NASDAQ grew from around 1,000 points in 1995 to more than 5,000 points in the year 2000. Companies were going to market with IPOs and fetching huge prices, with stocks sometimes doubling on the first day. So it seemed like this like machine, this money-making machine that, would just never stop. That was the potential of the internet. And, some entrepreneurs were inspired by these online companies like Amazon, like eBay, like Cosmo. But a lot of investors, they kind of ignored some of the fundamental rules of investing in the stock market, studying market trends, reviewing business plans, analyzing PE ratios. PE being, is short for, so PE is short for the ratio of a company's share price to its per share earnings. To calculate the PE, you take the current stock price of a company and divide it by its earnings per share. But we saw a lot of these investors were just ignoring those blatant signs that the bubble was about to burst. So in March of 2000, everything started to change. Like I said, for every Amazon, for every eBay, for every Yahoo that grew to be this multi-million-dollar company, hundreds of others failed. On March 10th, the combined values of the stocks on the NASDAQ was at $6.7 trillion. The crash began the very next day. And by March 30th, the NASDAQ was valued at $6 trillion. And by April, it was less. There was $5.8 trillion. So in less than a month, we saw nearly $1 trillion worth of stock value just completely evaporate. One JP Morgan analyst told Time magazine in April of 2000 that a lot of the companies were losing between $10 and $30 million a quarter, which, a company's not going to survive. It's not sustainable. So that was going to end with a lot of dead sites, a lot of lost investments. Companies started folding. Pets.com being one of them. Magazines started running stories advising investors how to limit their exposure to the tech sector, sensing that people were going to take a beating if their portfolios were too tied to .coms and other companies that were dropping like flies. But to put into perspective, during the 2000 Super Bowl, 17 .com companies had paid $44 million for ad spots, according to a Bloomberg article the following year. And at the 2001 Super Bowl, just 1 year after the bubble burst, only 3 .com companies ran during the game. The market crash cost investors about $5 trillion. And the collapse of these internet stocks precipitated the 2001 stock market crash, even more so than the 9/11 terrorist attacks. All right. And then and in May, so .coms became .bombs, basically. All right, let's move on to the Philippines. In May of 2000, after originating in the Philippines, the I Love You computer virus spread like wildfire and shut down computers throughout the world. I love you. I love you too. Thank you. Aw. No, this is a different. This is like an I love you that will fuck up your, computer to to a point where no geek and no genius will be able to bring it back to life. The I love you virus, sometimes referred to as love letter, was a computer worm that attacked tens of millions of Windows personal computers. It started spreading as an email attachment with the subject line "I love you," and a file extension, which most people just thought was a normal text file. But opening the attachment activated the VBS, or the Visual Basic Script interpreted file. The worm did damage on the local personal computer, overwriting random types of files, office files, image files, and sent a copy of itself to all the people, to all the addresses in your Windows address book used by Outlook. The impact, so the malware actually originated in the Pandacan neighborhood of Manila in the Philippines, moving first to Hong Kong, then to Europe, and finally to our neck of the woods in the U.S. Just as people were starting their Friday mornings, the outbreak was later estimated to have caused over $5 billion worth of damages worldwide, and it took an estimated $15 billion to remove the worm. So once it left the Philippines, about 10 days after it left, over 50 million infections had been reported, and it was estimated that 10% of internet-connected computers worldwide had been affected. To protect themselves, the Pentagon, CIA, and the British Parliament, and most large corporations decided to completely shut down. Oh, that was gross. I'm so sorry for that, guys. Where was I? So most large corporations decided to completely shut down their mail systems. And the I Love You virus was, and still is considered one of the world's most dangerous computer-related disasters. All right, we also had a preliminary draft in June of 2000. Preliminary draft of the genomes as part of the Human Genome Project is finished and announced at the White House by President Clinton. So, what is a genome? What is a genome, Antonio? Well, I'll tell you. About 50 years ago, not a lot was known about the genetic factors that contributed to human disease. So the Human Genome Project the HGP, refers to the international 13-year effort to discover all of the estimated 20,000 to 25,000 human genes and make them accessible for biological study. And it was a revolution, biotech revolution, and made the U.S. It played a major role in making us the global leader in the biotechnology sector. But let's go back. So what's a genome? A genome is an organism's complete set of DNA. DNA molecules, they're made up of two twisting paired strands, as we all have seen in high school and Jurassic Park. Each strand is made up of 4 chemical units called nucleotide bases. The bases are adenine, which is A, thymine, which is T, guanine, which is G, and cytosine, which is C. So based on opposite strands, bases on opposite strands pair specifically, and A, we learned, always pairs with a T, and a C always with a G. So actually, in checking this out, there was an analogy that the Human Genome Project put up to understand DNA. So it's kind of like, think of a book, right? So the book, the genome, would contain 23 chapters or chromosomes. Each chapter contains 48 to 250 million letters, which is we covered A, C, G, and T without spaces. So the book itself would contain about 3.2 billion letters in total. That book, or that genome, fits into a cell nucleus about the size of a pinpoint. And at least one copy of the book, all 23 chapters, is contained in most cells of our body. And I think we have actually some audio of former President Bill Clinton speaking on this.
More than 1,000 researchers across 6 nations have revealed nearly all 3 billion letters of our miraculous genetic code. I congratulate all of you on this stunning and humbling achievement. Today's announcement represents more than just an epoch-making triumph of science and reason. After all, when Galileo discovered he could use the tools of mathematics and mechanics to understand the motion of celestial bodies, he felt, in the words of one eminent researcher, that he had learned the language in which God created the universe. Today, we are learning the language in which God created life. We are gaining ever more awe for the complexity, the beauty, the wonder of God's most divine and sacred gift. With this profound new knowledge, humankind is on the verge of gaining immense new power to heal. Genome science will have a real impact on all our lives, and even more, on the lives of our children.
So as of today, the Human Genome Project has already helped us discover more than 1,800 disease genes, as opposed to, now our researchers can find a gene suspected of causing an inherited disease in a few days, as opposed to years that it took before. And the hope is kind of have this like personalized, a more personalized health diagnosis. So genome-based research will eventually enable medical science to develop highly effective diagnostic tools to kind of better understand our health needs based on our individual genetic makeups and design treatments that will be effective for disease. But again, a lot of work still needs to be done. And the genetics behind like really complex diseases like heart disease are still a ways away. Okay, going back to the world of computers, in February, Microsoft releases Windows 2000, and then in September of 2000, Steve Jobs introduces the public beta of Mac OS X in PAL-E. So the Mac OS X public beta, or internally codenamed Kodiak, was the first publicly available version of Apple's Mac OS X operating system, Cheetah, to feature OS enhancements like the now ubiquitous Aqua user interface, which had a lot of it included a lot of graphics additions and expanded crash-proofing features. It was released to the public on September 13th for $29.95. It allowed software developers and early adapters to test the upcoming, or not upcoming, but at the time it was upcoming, operating system and develop software for the forthcoming operating system before it was released. At its introduction, Steve Jobs said that one of his design goals was that when you saw it, you wanted to lick it. The public beta included a lot of the standard, apps now bundled in Mac OS X today. Text edit, preview, mail, QuickTime, terminal. Also included was a simple MP3 player. iTunes hadn't been introduced yet. Sketch, which was a basic vector drawing program demonstrating features of Quartz, and HTML edit. All right. And then lastly, on the science and innovation side of things, October 30th. This was the final date during which there was no human presence in space. So Soyuz TM-31 launches, carrying the first resident crew to the International Space Station. Of course, the ISS has been continually crewed ever since. In November 2nd, the first resident crew, Expedition 1, entered the International Space Station. They consisted of an American commander and 2 Russians. Bill Shepard, who was the American commander, he had been in space 3 times before. And, all on missions that lasted about a week. And then the Russian astronauts, Yuri Gidzenko and Sergei Kriklev, both had previous long duration, and I apologize to you guys if I said your names wrong. Both had previous long duration space flights on Mir, with Kriklev having spent over a full year in space. All right, guys. So we're kind of going through this. We're towards the end here, and let's go into culture. So the most popular films, or the highest grossing films in America, and we'll go. This is our sort of top 10 list. Starting at number 10, What Lies Beneath. Number 9, and that was from DreamWorks. Number 9, Fox's X-Men. Number 8, Warner Brothers' The Perfect Storm. Number 7, Universal's Meet the Parents. Universal also had number 6, which was How the Grinch Stole Christmas. Number 5, highest grossing film of the year, was Disney's Dinosaur. And then number 4 was Paramount's What Women Want. Number 3 was Fox's and DreamWorks' Castaway with Tom Hanks, which made $429 million. Number 2 was DreamWorks and Universal's Gladiator, which made $457 million. And the number 1 highest grossing film of the year was Mission Impossible 2 from Paramount, which made $546 million. Not a bad haul. Other well-known movies that came out that year: Almost Famous, American Psycho, Bamboozled, Best in Show, Bring It On, Boiler Room, Charlie's Angels, Coyote Ugly, Final Destination, High Fidelity, Little Nicky, Memento, Next Friday, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, Nurse Betty, The Original Kings of Comedy, Pay It Forward. I mean, there was a ton of great movies that came out this year. Pitch Black, Quills, Remember the Titans, Requiem for a Dream. That's always been a favorite of mine. Road Trip, Scary Movie, Scream 3, Shadow of the Vampire, Shaft, Snatch, The Tao of Steve, Traffic, Unbreakable, The Whole Nine Yards, Wonder Boys, and You Can Count on Me. There were also some not so great movies that came out in the year 2000. 2000 saw the release of Battlefield Earth with John Travolta, Dungeons and Dragons, The Watcher, The Ninth Gate. Actually, I don't know why. I like The Watcher. I don't know why it's on the. I like The Watcher. I thought Keanu Reeves was kind of crazy in it, but not so much with other people. What else was going on in film? So we had the let's go into awards a little bit. So we had the 20th Golden Raspberry Awards, which are given to the worst films of the year, and the worst film that won that year was Will Smith and Kevin Kline's Wild Wild West. On the flip side, the very next night was the 72nd Academy Awards. American Beauty won Best Picture. It beat The Cider House Rules, The Green Mile, The Insider, and The Sixth Sense to take the top prize of the night. Kevin Spacey and Hilary Swank won for lead actors, and winning supporting acting Oscars was Michael Caine and Angelina Jolie. And we also had the winner of the 53rd Cannes Film Festival, which was Dancer in the Dark, directed by Lars von Trier, who won the Palme d'Or. Other sort of cool movie news, 405, the movie. was released on June 5th. It was the first short film widely distributed on the internet. It is an example of one of the first viral film movies. Martin Scorsese's Bringing Out the Dead with Nicolas Cage as kind of a whacked out EMT is the last movie to be released on Laserdisc by a major studio. And now we're going to talk a little bit about TV. So what's going on TV-wise in 2000? We had a few channels debut. Boomerang, the Oxygen Network, SoapNet, VH1 Classic. Other shows also debuted. We had Blue's Clues, Curb Your Enthusiasm. A lot of great shows. Dark Angel, Malcolm in the Middle, Jackass, Soul Food, Dora the Explorer, 106 and Park, Girlfriends, Gilmore Girls, MTV Cribs, CSI, Boston Public, Queers Folk, C-Lab 2021, Aqua Teen Hunger Force, Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law, and the American premiere of a show that's still kicking, Survivor. Other sort of interesting TV news, David Letterman underwent quintuple heart bypass surgery in January of that year, and he later came back in February, bringing all of the doctors that had performed the operation out on stage with him. And the episode actually earned an Emmy Award nomination from that I guess unusual display of emotion on Letterman's side. May also saw the season finale of Dawson's Creek entitled True Love, which broadcast American television's first male gay kiss, which I doubt. I'm sure two dudes kissed each other at some point on TV before that, but that's what's listed in the annals of time. September 21st was the 30th anniversary of Monday Night Football on ABC. And then on the award side again, the 52nd Primetime Emmy Awards, hosted by the late, great Gary Shandling. Best Comedy Series went to Will and Grace, while lead actor and lead actress in a comedy series went to Michael J. Fox for Spin City and Patricia Heaton for Everybody Loves Raymond. And then on the drama side, best drama was The West Wing, and lead actor went to James Gandolfini in his, legendary performance as Tony Soprano for The Sopranos, and lead actress went to Celia Ward for Once and Again. On the book side of things, literature-wise, we had in July Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, which was the fourth book in the series by J.K. Rowling, was published in the UK and in the US. Stephen King's horror story, Riding the Bullet, is published in ebook format, which was the world's first mass-market electronic book. And then some of the cool books that came out that year, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon, The Blind Assassin by Margaret Atwood, Bee Season by Mila Goldberg, A Storm of Swords, all you Game of Thrones fans, I'm with y'all on that one, by George R.R. Martin, Joyce Carol Oates' Blonde, Zadie Smith's White Teeth, Philip Roth's The Human Stain, and Dave Eggers' A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius. All right, now let's go over to music and culture. So a bunch of things happen. I'm going to just go through these, guys. If you have any questions, save them for the end. January, we had Rage Against the Machine play in front of Wall Street, prompting an early closing of trading because of all the crowds that showed up. The $1 Million Hotel, which was a film co-written, and again, kind of a mix, music and movies, but The $1 Million Hotel was a film co-written by Bono, the lead singer of U2, that premiered at the 50th Berlin International Film Festival. And then the 42nd Annual Grammys In February, Santana won a record 8 Grammys in one night, tying Michael Jackson, who won 8 in 1984, and Christina Aguilera won Best New Artist. Metallica filed a lawsuit against the peer-to-peer service Napster, as well as Yale, a few universities, Yale, University of Southern California, Indiana, for copyright infringement. Yale and Indiana were later dropped from the suit when they blocked access to Napster on campus computers. And our old friend, Britney Spears, had her second album, Oops, I Did It Again, sell 1.3 million copies in its debut week and 500,000 on the first day of its release, giving it the highest first week sales by any solo artist in U.S. history. That is until Eminem came out with the Marshall Mathers LP a few weeks later. The album sold over 20 million copies, becoming the best-selling album by a female artist of the decade. That was Oops, I Did It Again. But we'll go back to M in a second. What else happened music-wise? Prince announced that he has changed his name back to Prince. The late great genius, musical genius Prince, changed his name back to Prince now that his publishing contract with Warner Chappell had expired. He had been known as an unpronounceable love symbol since 1993. Also, in the world of music, 50 Cent was shot 9 times in Queens on May 24th in Queens, New York. He had wounds in his hand, his arm, his hip, both legs, chest, and face. He lost a wisdom tooth. He has a scar on his face, a little bit of a slur in his voice. And that slur is actually caused by a small fragment of a bullet that his doctor decided not to take out because it would potentially do more harm than help. And then 50 spent 13 days in the hospital recovering. Then Eminem's second LP, the Marshall Mathers LP, sold 1.76 million copies on its debut week, becoming the fastest-selling rap album ever, according to the Guinness World Book of Records. Produced by Dr. Dre. Oh, that's probably a different Drizzy. No. Produced by Dr. Dre. The album breaks the previous record of 803,000 copies sold, set by Snoop Dogg's Doggy Style, which was incidentally also produced by Dr. Dre. And it went on to, the Marshall Mathers LP went on to win Best Rap Album in 2001. And then actually later on, and a lot of you guys may remember this, Eminem's mother went to court claiming defamation of character in a $10 million civil suit after taking exception to the line, "My mother smokes more dope than I do," from Eminem's single, "My Name Is." We also had some interesting events happen at the MTV Video Music Awards on September 7th. Rage Against the Machine's Tim Comerford is arrested for climbing on the set of the awards after his band lost the award for Best Rock Video to Limp Bizkit. And the director of Rage Against the Machine's Sleep Now in the Fire video, Michael Moore, of all people, said that Comerford was probably just bored by the show. But the MTV VMAs that year featured 2 iconic VMA performances. Britney Spears performed her hit single, Oops, I Did It Again, becoming famously controversial because of her skin-colored outfit. And NSYNC performed Bye Bye Bye. And then another award show that happened the next week, the first Latin Grammy Awards were held. And the big winners of that show was Luis Miguel, Santana, and Maná with 3 awards. And Juan Luis Guerra, Shakira, that just gave me chills. Shakira, we love you, Shakira, and Emilio Esteván Jr. received 2 awards each. Oh, as well as Fito Páez. And then rounding out the year, in September, Pearl Jam released 25 live albums, each taken from a different show on their European tour as the initial part of the Pearl Jam official bootleg series. All right, and moving on to the world of art. On May, we saw the opening of the Tate Modern in London, and later on in October, we saw the official opening of the Lowry Theatre and Gallery Centre in Salford, England, designed by Michael Wilford and Burrow Happold. Okay, time for sports, everybody. All right. Dan Marino won his last career NFL game, 20-17 versus Seattle. Dan Marino's last win was his first playoff road win and his 36th comeback win. And in the next round, in January 16th, also on the road, Marino and the Dolphins lost to the Jacksonville Jaguars, 62-7. The Dolphins' 55-point margin of loss was the worst in AFL playoff history, and it marked the end. The Jacksonville game did mark the end of Jim Johnson's coaching career, who he announced his retirement the very next day. In the world of golf, Tiger Woods was killing it. He was slaughtering. Tiger Woods, he set or tied a total of 27 PGA records during the year. He won the U.S. Open. He won the British Open, the PGA Championship. He was the PGA Tour Player of the Year. He was the PGA Tour Money Leader. And Tiger had actually won something like $9 million through golf in the year 2000. And then as for the champions of 2000, we had the BCS National Championship game, where the Florida State Seminoles won 49-29 over the Virginia Tech Hokies. January Super Bowl, the St. Louis Rams beat the Tennessee Titans 23-16 at the Georgia Dome. The Stanley Cup was contested by the New Jersey Devils, the Eastern Conference champion, and the Western Conference champion, Dallas Stars, who were actually the defending Stanley Cup champions. And the Devils won 4-2. 4 games to 2. The NBA championship, the Los Angeles Lakers beat the Indiana Pacers. Again, 4 games to 2. It was the Lakers' first title in 12 years. The WNBA Finals, the Houston Comets win 2 games to 0 over the New York Liberty to complete their four-peat. And some other, the World Series, of course. How can I forget this? I'm sure I was glued to the TV watching it every single game. The New York Yankees defeated the New York Mets 4-1. And won their third straight World Series championship with Derek Jeter as the series MVP. All right, guys, and if you know this sound, that is the iconic PlayStation 2 start screen, and that was released in Japan. Was the PlayStation 2 game system on March 4th, released in Japan, and a few months later it became the best-selling game console of all time. And actually in April of year 2000, we had Nintendo sell their 100th million Game Boy handheld console. All right, so we're going to end the show, as we always do, with a few bullet points in the year 2000. And bullet points for the year. So May 11th, the billionth living person in India is born. Astha, which means faith in Hindu, Aurora, was officially declared India's 1 billionth baby. we had the final original Peanuts comic strip published following the death of its creator, Charles Schulz, who was he was the cartoonist, as you guys, all you Peanuts fans know. The Charles Schulz was the cartoonist who created the Peanut comic strip, and he had died in his sleep after a battle with colon cancer. Peanuts debuted in 1950 and went on to become the most widely read comic strip and the most beloved group of comic characters in the world, with an audience of 355 million people in 75 countries. And the very last strip is, Charlie Brown is on the phone and says, "No, I think he's sleeping." And then the next thing we see is Snoopy writing. Oh, I'm sorry, no. Charlie Brown is on the phone and says, "No, I think he's writing." And then we go over and see Snoopy writing. We see a shot of Snoopy writing. All right, some other cool stuff. Millennium Force opened at Cedar Point Amusement Park in Ohio. It was the world's tallest and fastest It is the world's tallest and fastest roller coaster. Upon completion in 2000, the Millennium Force broke 6 world records, and was called the world's first Giga Coaster, which is a roller coaster that exceeds 300 feet in height. It was briefly the tallest and fastest in the world until Steel Dragon 2000 opened later that year. So let's look at the records. Millennium Force has held the records for the following: first ever complete circuit roller coaster to top 300 feet. Tallest complete circuit roller coaster. Longest drop. Oh my God. I'm a roller coaster nut. So when I hear all this stuff, I'm like, I need to go to Cedar Point, like straight away. Fastest complete circuit roller coaster. Steepest non-inversion bank turn on a roller coaster. And the first roller coaster to utilize a cable lift system. All right. And then on June 13th, Samuel Jackson is honored with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Sam Jackson, who doesn't love this guy? He's one of the most bankable actors in the world. His movies have made more than, they've made billions of dollars. And this year, actually, in the year 2000, he was in a few films, most notably Shaft, the remake of the classic 70s detective story, John Shaft, and M. Night Shyamalan's Unbreakable. And I think we have a clip from those films now.
Bro, I'll be out in an hour.
I don't think so, running man. You see, the van to central processing left about 5 minutes ago. And that won't be another one for hours and hours. By the time you get downtown, we're talking overnight in the Tombs. And they definitely want to rain your ass before morning. It's a shame we didn't get here a little sooner. You look depressed, Walter. You depressed? Yo, peeps, you still here?
The seatbelt on the bind was busted.
Oh, damn.
It's called habeas corpus, motherfucker. That means due process for the illiterate.
It's called You Wanted to Play Games with Me, peoples. I know a shitload of games. You boys play nice.
You know what the scariest thing is? To not know your place in this world. To not know why you're here. It's just an awful feeling. Have you done? I almost gave up hope. There were so many times I questioned myself. You killed all those people. But I found you. So many sacrifices. Just
Awesome. All right. Other quick bullet points. Oprah Winfrey debuted O Magazine. Bill Clinton was announced that GPS access would no longer be restricted to the U.S. military. He was also the first sitting U.S. president to visit Vietnam since the end of the Vietnam War. In November, the U.S. Drug Enforcement the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration discovered one of the country's largest LSD labs inside a converted military missile silo in Wamego, Kansas. Agents said that their investigation showed the lab produced tens of millions of doses of LSD each month. And Shirley Armstead, who was a spokesman for the DEA office in St. Louis, told reporters after the arrest, they are predicting that this laboratory, quote, they are predicting that this laboratory could have been supplying a third of the LSD in the United States and maybe the world. Quote, end quote. All right, a few other major elections. Vicente Fox was elected president of Mexico as candidate of the rightist National Action Party, ending 71 years of the institutional Revolutionary Party rule in Mexico. And Vladimir Putin was elected president of Russia after the unexpected resignation of Boris Yeltsin. And the Pyrenean ibex went extinct in the year 2000. One of two subspecies of the Spanish ibex, the Pyrenean ibex, once ranged across, and it's kind of like a deer. Think of a deer with like awesome antlers. Once ranged across the Pyrenees in France and Spain and the surrounding areas. A few hundred years ago, they were pretty numerous, but by 1900, their numbers had fallen to less than 100. And the last natural Pyrenean ibex, a female named Celia, was found dead on January 6th next to a fallen tree. Although the cause of the death is unknown, the reason for the extinction of the subspecies as a whole is a mystery still. Scientists hypothesize that maybe it was an inability to compete with other resources for food, infections and diseases, as well as poaching. And finally, let's look at the words of the year in 2000 from the American Dialect Society. They chose these words as the words of the year for 2000. Most likely to succeed, muggle, which was a Harry Potter term for a non-wizard, also known as a mundane or unimaginative person. Most useful word of the year, civil union. Most creative word, .bomb, which is a failed .com company. We talked a little bit about that before. Most unnecessary word of the year, sudden loss of wealth syndrome. Least likely to succeed word of the year, kablookies, used in phrases like, it scared the kablookies out of me. Most outrageous word of the year, wall humping, which is when you, and I've been guilty of this more times than I like to admit, when you rub your thigh up against the security card scanner to allow access without having to take the card out of your pocket. And the 2000 word of the year was Chad from the 2000 presidential election controversy in Florida, which is, again, a small scrap of paper punched from a voting card. But also chosen in 2000, word of the decade was web. Word of the 20th century was jazz. And the word of the millennium was she. All right, guys, thank you so much for listening to me as we explored all the different events in the year 2000. Thank you so much for listening to Radio Retrospekt, wherever you're listening. I really, humbly, truly, sincerely, but greatly appreciate it. You can reach us at Radio Retrospekt. That's Radio Retrospekt with a K at the end. Radio Retrospekt at gmail.com, and on the social tip at Radio Retrospekt. Wherever you are, I hope you're doing well, and thank you again. See you next time.